Mason adjusted the strap of his well-worn camera bag, feeling the chill of anticipation roll down his spine as he read the letter again. It had come out of nowhere, a simple piece of thick, weathered paper folded neatly into an unassuming envelope, with no return address and the faint scent of pine clinging to it. The letter was penned in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl, inviting him to a place he'd only ever dreamed of, Alaska's northernmost frontier. There, deep within the sprawling, untouched wilderness, countless stories of strange sightings and eerie disappearances had woven themselves into the fabric of the land. Tales of creatures as old as the mountains, rumored to lurk in the dark shadows, waiting. The invitation spoke of an expedition, one that wasn't for the faint of heart. And though the words were plain, the implications couldn't have been clearer. Whoever had written this knew what they were after and had handpicked their team accordingly. Proof, it promised, of a truth hidden from the world. The words were enough to stir something within Mason, something that both terrified and thrilled him. The flight was long and silent, the plane's engines humming steadily as they glided over dense forests blanketed in mist. The small town of Coldwater, Alaska, lay beneath them, a smudge of light and life surrounded by an endless sea of trees. Mason peered out the window, his breath fogging the glass as he marveled at the desolate beauty below. His heart raced as they descended, but an inexplicable heaviness settled on his shoulders. A weight that had less to do with the altitude and more with the foreboding sense of stepping into the unknown. At the Coldwater airport, he was met by a tall, wiry man whose eyes bore the unmistakable stamp of experience. And something darker, an edge that suggested he'd seen things that couldn't be easily explained. The man introduced himself as Ian, the expedition's survivalist, and gave Mason a firm handshake, his calloused hand cold and rough. "Ready to see what Alaska has in store for you?" Ian asked with a smirk that hinted at secrets yet to be revealed. They made their way through town, where the locals offered sidelong glances, whispers rippling among them like leaves caught in a gust. Mason could feel their stares, their silent warnings. He tried to shake it off as the usual curiosity reserved for outsiders, but something in their eyes made him feel watched. Later that night, as the group gathered at a small, dimly lit tavern on the edge of town, Mason finally met the rest of the team. Each person seemed as if they'd been plucked from a different world. The cryptozoologist, Dr. Ellis, a wiry man with glasses that reflected the dim candlelight, scribbled notes feverishly, his excitement palpable. The local guide, Naira, sat quietly, exuding a calm strength that belied the sharpness in her gaze. She had spent her life in these woods and seemed almost part of the wilderness itself. As the tavern's low murmur filled the air, an elderly man approached them, his face craggy as the mountains, his eyes shadowed with the weight of decades. Without invitation, he placed a hand on the table and leaned in, his voice a gravelly whisper. "You're heading into dark lands, lands that take more than they give back. Some things were never meant to be found." He locked eyes with each of them, one by one, as if marking their souls, his final gaze resting on Mason. "Beware what you seek in those woods," he rasped, "for it may find you first." The firelight flickered across his face, casting strange shadows, and for a moment Mason saw something in the old man's eyes, a glimmer of fear, or perhaps the remnants of a long-buried memory. With a shiver running through him, Mason knew this wasn't going to be any ordinary expedition. Mason lay in his small, dimly lit motel room, eyes wide open, as the old man's warning replayed in his mind like a broken record. Outside, the wind howled against the walls, and the windows rattled in their frames as if struggling to break free from the frozen air beyond. Sleep wouldn't come easily tonight. He could feel the anticipation settling in, that thin layer of electricity in the air that hinted at something monumental, something dangerous. The journey would begin tomorrow at dawn, and despite himself, Mason felt the weight of expectation pressing down, along with an instinctual unease gnawing at the edges of his mind. He had been on expeditions before, traveled to places with stories older than memory, where people spoke of spirits and creatures that defied understanding. But this felt different. This wasn't just a story whispered around campfires. This was real, tangible, inescapable. He could feel it in his bones. Morning came with a bitter chill, the kind that bit straight through to the skin. He dressed in layers, each garment heavy with the scent of travel and adventure, and met the others in the lobby. Naira was already waiting, quiet and watchful, her eyes scanning each of them as they arrived, a silent assessment of their worth. Ian gave Mason a curt nod, already busy packing gear into the battered old Jeep that would take them as far as the roads allowed. And then there was Dr. Ellis, a bundle of nervous energy, mumbling to himself as he flipped through notes and maps, his brow furrowed in concentration. Once the last of their supplies were loaded, Naira took the driver's seat, her hands steady on the wheel as she led them out of the town and onto a gravel road that stretched endlessly into the heart of the wilderness. It didn't take long before the last signs of civilization faded into the distance, swallowed by towering pines and mist that hung like ghostly shrouds over the treetops. The road grew rougher with each passing mile, but no one spoke. There was a silence among them now, an unspoken pact to let the forest itself dictate the terms of their journey. After an hour of jolting along the rugged path, Naira pulled the Jeep to a stop beside a trailhead that was barely visible through the dense underbrush. A wooden sign, faded and weather-beaten, bore strange symbols that none of them could recognize. "This is as far as the vehicle goes," Naira announced, her voice carrying an edge of finality. They each took a moment to adjust their packs, securing gear and double-checking supplies. As they stood there, Mason noticed something unsettling: the complete absence of sound. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the hollow silence that clung to the trees like a second skin. The others must have noticed it too, as Dr. Ellis looked around, his fingers twitching nervously on the straps of his pack while Ian kept a hand near his hunting knife. "Everyone ready?" Naira asked, casting her gaze across the group. Mason nodded, his throat suddenly dry, though he forced himself to meet her stare with what he hoped looked like resolve. With a slight nod, Naira turned and began to lead them into the woods, her footsteps silent and sure. Mason followed closely, each step feeling as though he were crossing an invisible threshold, moving deeper into a place that seemed to reject their presence. The trail wound through the trees, narrow and treacherous, and every now and then Mason caught glimpses of strange markings carved into the bark, symbols that seemed almost deliberate, though eroded by time. He tried to capture them with his camera, but each click felt loud, almost intrusive in the silence. As they moved further, he felt it again, that prickling sensation of being watched, of something unseen moving just beyond the edge of his vision, melting back into the shadows before he could fully catch it. He shook his head, brushing the feeling aside. It was just nerves, he told himself. They were barely an hour in. But even as he tried to focus, he couldn't shake the creeping certainty that the forest knew they were here, and was waiting. The forest seemed to close in around them as they moved deeper, trees arching overhead like skeletal hands interlocked in a silent vigil. Mist clung to the ground, thickening with each step, swirling around their ankles and giving the woods an eerie, otherworldly quality. The chill of the morning had only intensified, sinking into Mason's bones despite the layers he wore. The silence had become oppressive, a weight that made even the slightest sound, like a twig snapping beneath a boot, echo unnaturally loud in the stillness. Ahead, Naira moved with an almost instinctual precision, her eyes scanning every detail, her posture calm and confident. Mason marveled at her ease, contrasting sharply with his own growing unease. Behind him, Dr. Ellis muttered to himself, words half-spoken, a mixture of theories and personal reminders. Occasionally, Mason could hear Ian grumbling, perhaps voicing his disapproval of Ellis's constant mumbling, but the two kept a wary distance from each other, maintaining the strange tension that had lingered since their initial meeting. It wasn't long before Mason began to notice unusual patterns around them. The trees seemed twisted in odd directions, their branches contorted as though they'd grown around some invisible barrier, bending away from the path. Shadows moved strangely here, flickering even without a clear source of light. Every so often, he thought he glimpsed shapes darting between the trees, but when he looked closer, there was nothing, just the mist and the quiet, oppressive forest. A few hours in, Naira paused, raising a hand to signal for them to stop. The group halted, each member on edge, instinctively scanning their surroundings. Mason's fingers tightened around his camera, and he lifted it to his eye, letting the lens sweep across the fog-blanketed forest. Through the viewfinder, the world looked even stranger, the mist framing dark shapes and figures that seemed to morph and shift as he focused on them. His pulse quickened. "Look here," Naira murmured, crouching near the base of a tree. Mason and the others moved closer, peering over her shoulder. Etched into the bark were crude symbols, jagged lines that formed a pattern neither Mason nor the others recognized. The markings looked fresh, the cuts clean, standing out against the rough bark like a warning. Naira traced the symbols with a gloved finger, her face unreadable. "What do they mean?" Mason whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "They're not local," she replied, her voice equally hushed. "I've never seen these symbols in the native language, but they're..." She trailed off, casting a glance over her shoulder as if expecting someone or something to be watching. "Doctor." Ellis crouched down beside her, pushing his glasses up his nose as he examined the carvings with fascination. "It could be territorial markers," he suggested, a glint of excitement in his eyes. "Primitive, but purposeful. Perhaps a way of claiming the land, warning others to stay away. Typical behavior in higher primates." He spoke with an air of enthusiasm, as though the danger was a trivial detail in the face of discovery. Ian snorted, folding his arms. Territorial markers for what, exactly? We're miles from anything remotely resembling civilization. Who'd be out here carving warnings? No one answered. The forest around them held its breath, as if waiting. Mason felt a sudden urge to move, to leave this spot before something lurking just beyond their line of sight decided to answer that question for them. As they prepared to continue, a low rumble reverberated through the trees, distant but distinct. It sounded like thunder, but the sky was clear, and there was a guttural, unnatural quality to it that made the hairs on the back of Mason's neck stand on end. They all froze, straining their ears to locate the source of the sound. The noise died away as quickly as it had come, leaving an even heavier silence in its wake. The mist thickened, swirling around them as though stirred by unseen hands. Naira straightened, her face pale, and motioned for them to move forward. No words were spoken, but the urgency in her movements was enough to propel them into action. With every step, Mason felt a growing dread, a sense that something had shifted around them, that the forest was closing in, watching. His heartbeat echoed in his ears as they moved deeper, each footfall swallowed by the fog. And in that dense, oppressive silence, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line, unknowingly stepped into a place where no human should ever tread. As they moved forward, the mist thickened, swirling in dense pockets that seemed to absorb the light, creating shadows that danced just beyond their sight. Mason's eyes darted from one movement to another, unsure if they were real or tricks of his mind. Every so often, he would catch what seemed like a dark shape lurking in the periphery, only to turn and find nothing but an empty stretch of fog and trees. The unease was settling in deeper now, seeping through his nerves like ice water. Ahead of him, Naira moved with purpose, her posture stiff and tense, like a predator walking into unfamiliar territory. She raised her hand suddenly, a gesture for silence. They all stopped in their tracks, listening. This time, even Dr. Ellis had gone silent, his usual murmurings replaced by an intense focus on the forest around them. Mason held his breath, straining to hear anything beyond the soft crunch of leaves beneath his feet. Then, faintly, there was a sound, a rustling that seemed to come from everywhere at once, the kind of sound that reminded Mason of a whisper, just on the edge of being audible. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but insistent, like something lurking just out of sight, waiting for them to let their guard down. "Did you hear that?" Mason whispered, his voice barely breaking the silence. Naira nodded, her gaze fixed ahead. "We keep moving," she replied, her voice steady but low. "Stay close. No one falls behind." The instruction was clear, but the sense of foreboding didn't lift as they pressed on. The air felt heavier, thick with a strange metallic taste that clung to the back of Mason's throat. As they moved deeper, the trees became more twisted, their trunks gnarled and bent, almost as though they'd been deliberately contorted by some unseen force. He couldn't shake the impression that the forest was changing, warping around them the further they went. An hour passed, maybe two. It was hard to keep track of time in this endless gray haze. Then, without warning, They came upon something that stopped them all cold. A large clearing, surrounded by trees whose branches twisted together like a woven fence. At the center stood a towering wooden structure, crude yet unmistakable, a totem-like form reaching up toward the sky. It was crafted from broken tree limbs and vines, forming a rough, humanoid figure with long arms that stretched upward, its head turned toward the heavens as if in some silent, eternal scream. Mason felt a chill crawl up his spine as he looked at the structure, a sense of something ancient and powerful emanating from it. Dr. Ellis stepped forward, his eyes wide with fascination. This is remarkable," he whispered, pulling out his notebook to scrawl quick sketches and notes. "It resembles effigies found in indigenous cultures, but there's something more primitive here, something ritualistic." Naira watched with a wary eye, her hands clenched at her sides. "This isn't something we should linger near," she warned, her voice low, yet firm. "There are stories about places like this, places where things cross over." Mason swallowed, feeling the weight of her words settle over him like a shroud. He lifted his camera slowly, almost reluctantly, and took a few photos, each click sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. But as he lowered the camera, a shiver ran through him. He couldn't shake the feeling that capturing this was somehow wrong, as though he were stealing something sacred, or worse, inviting something to follow them. As they turned to leave the clearing, Ian paused, his gaze fixed on a set of footprints barely visible in the mud near the base of the totem. The prints were huge, much larger than any humans, with clawed toes that dug deep into the soil. "These aren't bear tracks," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Whatever made these, it's not something I've seen in any forest." They exchanged uneasy glances, each silently grappling with the implications. The tracks led away from the totem, disappearing into the shadows at the far end of the clearing. Without another word, they resumed their march, each step heavier than the last, the path ahead now shadowed by a growing sense of dread. The forest closed in around them once more, thicker and darker, as if angered by their intrusion. And as they moved, Mason could feel it, that oppressive, watchful presence closing in, its gaze unblinking, cold and patient. They continued through the dense forest, a silence heavy and unnatural settling over them. The air felt charged, as if holding its breath. Mason's every step felt labored, the weight of the pack on his back now only a fraction of what pressed down on his mind. He couldn't shake the sensation that the clearing they'd left was somehow following them, or that its influence lingered, sticking to them like fog on a damp morning. He glanced back more than once, his instincts screaming that something was back there, pacing them, just out of sight. The others seemed equally tense. Ian's jaw was clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle of his knife. Even Dr. Ellis had fallen into a rare silence, his gaze unfocused, as though wrestling with a thought he couldn't quite articulate. Only Naira seemed calm, though her eyes remained sharp, flicking from side to side as they walked, constantly scanning for any hint of movement. They pressed on until the trees began to thin, revealing an old, disused trail that wound through a small valley. Naira stopped abruptly, holding up her hand again. Mason's breath hitched as he noticed her eyes narrow, her expression hardening. In the middle of the trail, nearly swallowed by the mist, was a small, weather-beaten shrine. It was little more than a pile of rocks arranged in a rough circle, with an assortment of strange objects placed within. Small bones, twisted sticks, feathers tied together with sinew. The whole thing exuded an aura of neglect, like it had been there for centuries, forgotten by all except the forest itself. Naira knelt beside the shrine, a look of solemnity passing over her face as she studied the objects carefully. She muttered a few words under her breath, too quiet for anyone to make out. Mason felt the urge to ask her about it, to understand what this meant, but something in the air held his question back, as if speaking would be a violation of whatever power lay dormant here. Dr. Ellis, however, couldn't contain his curiosity. "Is this some kind of offering?" he asked, his voice loud in the muffled stillness. "Do the locals believe this will appease something?" Naira's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for the first time, Mason saw a flicker of fear there. "We believe that respect is owed to things older than us," she said, her tone sharp but restrained. "You should all keep that in mind." Ian scoffed softly, shaking his head, but said nothing. Mason, however, couldn't ignore the unease that had settled in his gut. He felt a compulsion to reach into his bag, pulling out a small trinket he kept for good luck, a carved wooden bear his father had given him years ago. Without quite knowing why, he placed it on the shrine, a silent offering. The moment he set it down, a strange calm washed over him, as though he'd done something right, something necessary. They left the shrine behind, but the weight of it followed them, mingling with the mist that continued to wind around their ankles. As they moved down the trail, Mason could swear the fog had thickened again, obscuring their view until it felt like they were wading through a sea of white, each step becoming more dreamlike, disorienting. After what felt like hours of winding through the narrow path, Naira stopped again, looking back at them with a gravity that made Mason's stomach twist. "This is the last point to turn back," she said, her voice carrying an unusual edge. "From here on, we enter what my people call the Veiled Lands. There are rules here, things we don't question, things we don't disturb." Dr. Ellis chuckled nervously. "Is this necessary? We're scientists, explorers." Naira's gaze silenced him immediately. "You may think this is just another forest, but it isn't. This place, it remembers, and it will remind us of things we've forgotten." Her eyes lingered on each of them. "If you don't believe, you're welcome to turn back now. But if you choose to continue, you must accept that not everything can be explained." The group exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them spoke, each one silently deciding to press on, curiosity too powerful to yield to superstition. Yet as they resumed their path, Mason felt a finality settle over him. It was as if they'd crossed an invisible line, left the world they knew behind, and stepped into something older, darker, and far less forgiving. With every step, the forest around them seemed to deepen, shadows stretching longer, the mist thickening into an almost physical presence. And as they pushed forward, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that whatever dwelled here was watching, waiting, and biding its time. As they ventured further into the Veiled Lands, the world around them grew denser, almost as if the trees themselves were shifting closer, tightening the path and blocking out what little light had filtered through before. Mason felt a strange weight settle in the air, pressing down on them, making each step feel heavier than the last. The temperature seemed to drop as well, though the forest was still, with not even the faintest breeze to justify the chill that was seeping into his bones. The silence was now absolute. Not a single bird called, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, only the crunch of their footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The absence of natural sounds unnerved him. It was as if the entire forest had gone dormant, or worse, as if it were watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. Ian had taken point alongside Naira, his usually gruff demeanor tempered by the intensity of the surroundings. His knife was out now, and he gripped it tightly, his gaze darting into the shadows. Even Dr. Ellis, who had thus far shown a relentless enthusiasm for uncovering mysteries, was subdued, his face tight with concentration as he scanned their surroundings. After another stretch of silence, Mason couldn't resist asking, his voice barely above a whisper, "What exactly are the Veiled Lands, Naira?" "You keep saying they're different, that there are rules here. What does that mean?" Naira didn't look back as she answered, her voice a low murmur that somehow seemed to carry through the still air. "The Veiled Lands are part of our old stories, places where the world is thin, where things cross over, where boundaries aren't what they seem." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The elders say it's a place that remembers the ancient ones, things that walked here before men did. Some say those things never really left." Mason felt a prickle at the back of his neck, an involuntary shiver he couldn't suppress. "Ancient ones?" he repeated, uncertain if he wanted to know more. She gave a brief, grim nod. "Spirits, or perhaps creatures, powerful beings that don't think like we do, don't follow our rules. They are older than language, older than anything we know." She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes warning. "The stories say they don't take kindly to those who come here with ill intent or those who seek to understand them for the sake of curiosity alone." Ian muttered something under his breath, though he said nothing outright. Mason could see the tension etched into his expression, the muscle in his jaw twitching. Dr. Ellis looked at Naira with a faint smirk, skepticism still lingering in his eyes, though he said nothing. They continued in silence until they reached a narrow ravine, choked with rocks and twisted roots that jutted from the earth like skeletal hands reaching skyward. Naira motioned for them to stay close as she carefully picked her way down the uneven path, her footsteps unnervingly quiet on the loose gravel. Halfway down, Mason noticed something peculiar. A faint scent on the air, something pungent and sour, like decaying foliage mixed with damp earth. He turned to the others, catching the same look of unease in their faces as they picked up the scent as well. The air grew thick with it, cloying, almost like a warning they couldn't ignore. They emerged on the other side of the ravine, where the path suddenly widened into a clearing, and in the center stood something that stole the breath from Mason's lungs. It was another effigy, larger than the last, a monstrous figure crafted from twisted branches and bones, towering high above them. It loomed, casting an unnatural shadow, its empty eyes staring out from a crude face carved with precision that felt almost deliberate. Dr. Ellis stepped closer, his face a mixture of awe and terror, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. It's a warning, isn't it? He whispered, reaching out a hand, his fingers trembling. Nara stepped forward and pulled his hand back firmly. Touch nothing, she commanded, her voice low but firm. This isn't for us. We've already come too close. They all took a step back, each of them breathing heavily, as if they'd narrowly avoided some unseen danger. Mason glanced at the effigy one last time, feeling the hollow stare of its wooden eyes on him. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that this was no ordinary warning. As they turned to leave the clearing, the first low growl echoed through the trees, distant yet unmistakable. The sound rippled through the silence, carrying a primal threat that was older than words, older than fear itself. And in that moment, Mason understood. Whatever lurked here was aware of their presence, and it had no intention of letting them leave unscathed. The growl faded, but its echoes seemed to linger, vibrating through the trees and the mist, settling in their bones. Mason's instincts screamed at him to turn back, to run, but they were deep in now, far beyond the point of retreat. He glanced at the others, seeing his own fear mirrored in their expressions. Even Ian, with all his bravado, looked shaken, his grip tightening on his knife until his knuckles turned white. Naira stood still, her gaze fixed on the dark line of trees ahead, as though listening for something just beyond their sight. The forest was alive in a way Mason had never felt before. It was as if the very air was watching them, waiting, weighing their worth. "We need to move quickly," Naira said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon whatever had growled. "Stay close and don't make any sudden sounds." No one argued. They followed her lead, keeping their footsteps as quiet as possible. Mason's heart pounded in his chest, each beat feeling like a countdown to some inevitable encounter. He scanned the shadows constantly, his senses heightened, every rustle and flicker of movement magnified in the silence. His camera hung heavily around his neck, and he found himself unwilling to reach for it, as if the act of taking a photo would somehow invite the forest's wrath. The path twisted ahead of them, leading down into a small hollow surrounded by ancient, towering trees. The ground here was softer, covered in a thick layer of moss that swallowed their footsteps, rendering them almost silent. The air was dense, humid, and carried the faint, decaying scent that had haunted them since they crossed into the veiled lands. It filled Mason's lungs with each breath, making him feel lightheaded, almost dizzy. As they moved through the hollow, Mason noticed something strange. Small trinkets scattered in the moss and half buried in the earth. Bones, tiny and delicate, arranged in careful patterns alongside weathered stones etched with symbols. Feathers, faded and brittle, lay tied together with sinew. They were offerings, left as though in reverence or fear. Ian nudged one of the bones with his boot, eyes narrowing. "This place is wrong," he muttered, voice thick with unease. "Nothing out here should be this quiet, this dead." Naira shot him a sharp look. "I told you, this place isn't ours to disturb. Every mark, every symbol, it means something." Her gaze softened just slightly. "This is their land. We're only guests." Dr. Ellis seemed almost entranced, crouching beside one of the arrangements with awe in his eyes. "It's remarkable," he murmured. "A culture existing outside of our understanding. These offerings, they're signs of reverence, of respect for whatever dwells here." He reached out a tentative hand, fingers hovering over the stones. Don't touch it! Naira's voice cracked through the silence, urgent and alarmed. Ellis froze, his hand jerking back as though burned. She glared at him, her eyes fierce. You don't touch what isn't yours. That's the first rule. Ellis gave a small, reluctant nod, clearly embarrassed but unwilling to push the matter further. They continued through the hollow, each of them more cautious now, careful to avoid disturbing any of the strange arrangements scattered along their path. Then, as they neared the edge of the hollow, Mason felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see a figure lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the trees and the mist, still and silent. Yet the sensation persisted, growing stronger with each step. They emerged from the hollow and began ascending a slope, the path growing steeper and narrower. The air felt colder here, sharp against their skin, and the mist was thicker, clinging to them like a damp shroud. The sense of unease coiled tighter around them, winding through the group like a living thing. Then, just as they reached the crest of the slope, Naira halted abruptly, holding up a hand for silence. Mason stopped short behind her, barely managing to keep his balance on the uneven ground. Ahead of them, nestled between the trees, was a narrow clearing, lit by a strange, otherworldly glow that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Pale light seeped up through cracks in the earth, casting long shadows across the clearing, shadows that twisted and shifted in ways that defied logic. In the center of the clearing, half shrouded in mist, stood another effigy. This one was different from the others, larger and far more intricate. Its limbs were long and slender, woven from what looked like human bones and tree branches, its face marked by hollow eye sockets that seemed to stare directly at them. Mason's breath hitched, his body frozen in place as he took in the sight. The effigy seemed to radiate a cold, malevolent energy, something far darker than anything they'd encountered yet. And as he stood there, he realized with a sickening certainty that they were no longer mere guests. They had crossed a line, and the forest, whatever dwelled within it, was no longer content to simply watch. Mason's pulse thundered in his ears as he stared at the effigy looming before them, his breath shallow and quick. The structure seemed alive, the hollow eye sockets boring into him, filling him with a primal dread he couldn't rationalize. A metallic taste spread across his tongue as he forced himself to look away, glancing at the others. They were all rooted to the spot, each face reflecting a blend of awe and terror. Even Naira, typically stoic, looked unnerved, her hand clenched around a pendant at her neck as if it were her only tether to sanity. The cold glow from the ground seemed to intensify, casting long shadows that writhed across the trees, taking on forms that looked disturbingly humanoid in their twisting shapes. The shadows stretched toward them, flickering and shifting like smoke caught in a draft, as though reaching out to pull them closer. "What is this?" Dr. Ellis stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He reached for his notebook, hands trembling as he scribbled feverishly, desperate to document the impossible sight before him. "This isn't natural," Ian muttered, taking a step back, his eyes darting to the surrounding trees. "I don't know what the hell we've stumbled into, but we need to leave. Now." Naira shook her head slowly, her voice quiet but firm. "Leaving now won't change anything. We've already crossed into its territory. We're part of this place now, for better or worse." She turned, meeting each of their gazes with a look of steely resolve. "If we go, we do it calmly. This forest, it responds to fear." Mason clenched his jaw, willing his body to stay steady, but the oppressive atmosphere was like a weight pressing down on him. He could barely focus as they began to back away from the clearing, trying to avoid looking at the effigy. Yet he could feel its presence, looming, watching, and he knew it would haunt his vision long after they left. Just as they turned to descend the slope, a low, guttural sound rippled through the air, freezing them all in their tracks. It wasn't the growl they'd heard earlier. This was closer, more deliberate, carrying an almost human resonance that made Mason's skin crawl. He held his breath, straining his ears as the sound grew louder, reverberating through the trees like a pulse, slow and ominous. Then came a rustling, faint at first but unmistakable, moving in the shadows at the edge of the clearing. Mason squinted, and for a moment he thought he saw a figure, a hulking silhouette, massive and indistinct, just beyond the reach of the pale light. His heart skipped, a paralyzing fear rooting him to the ground as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. "Do not look," Naira hissed, her voice sharp, breaking him from his trance. "Keep your gaze down. Move quickly and quietly. Do not acknowledge it." It took every ounce of Mason's willpower to obey, his legs moving with a jerky stiffness as he turned his head down, focusing on his boots as he followed Naira's lead. Each step felt labored, the silence amplifying every crunch of leaves underfoot, every snap of a twig. The others followed suit, no one daring to break the fragile spell of quiet they were trying to cast around themselves. As they crept back through the trees, the presence seemed to follow, a heavy, lumbering shadow weaving through the woods, matching their pace. The smell of decaying earth and damp moss filled Mason's lungs, thick and sickly, as the feeling of being hunted clawed at his senses. Ian whispered, barely audible, "It's not letting us leave." Naira's voice was a tense whisper in return. "Keep moving. Do not stop until we're back in familiar territory." The rustling grew closer, and Mason could feel it, the creature's gaze, sharp and heavy, slicing through the trees, its unseen eyes fixed on them with an intensity that seemed to seep through his skin. He could almost picture it in his mind. A massive figure with unblinking eyes, a form ancient and furious, stalking them silently. He dared not turn to see if his vision was true. They kept their pace, the forest closing in tighter, the trees feeling more like walls, confining them, trapping them in a narrowing path. Just when Mason thought he could no longer bear the tension, the path finally widened, revealing a stretch of forest that looked almost normal, familiar. Naira paused, allowing everyone a moment to catch their breath. Mason looked up, feeling a faint relief, until he noticed that the shadows around them hadn't dissipated. They were still being watched, still being followed. Naira's face was grim, her eyes reflecting a sorrowful knowledge. It won't stop. Not until we're out of the Veiled Lands. Her words hung heavily in the air. They weren't safe, not yet. And as Mason looked back into the forest's depths, he could sense it, the relentless shadow lingering at the edge of sight, waiting. The forest path felt narrower than before, each step carrying them deeper into an oppressive silence that bordered on suffocating. Mason kept his gaze down, focusing on Naira's steady, guiding steps ahead of him, but he could feel the weight of the unseen presence following them. Every so often he glanced sideways, catching fleeting movements in his peripheral vision. Shadows shifting, twisting, only to disappear when he tried to look directly. They moved in single file, an unspoken pact keeping them close and silent. Ian was at the back of the line, his knife held low but ready, his gaze darting around as though he could catch whatever haunted them by sheer vigilance. Dr. Ellis stumbled more than once, his normally energetic demeanor dimmed to one of strained caution. The weight of fear had seeped into all of them, tangible as the cold mist clinging to the ground. The trail wound down into a darkened hollow, flanked by thick, ancient pines that towered over them, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. The shadows here were darker, denser, pooling around their feet, and Mason had the distinct feeling they were wading through something alive, something that seemed to pull at their every step. A sudden crack of a branch shattered the silence, startling everyone. Ian whipped around, knife raised, but there was nothing there, only the trees, motionless and indifferent. Dr. Ellis swallowed audibly, his face pale, and muttered, This isn't logical. Shadows don't just follow people." Naira shot him a warning look. "This isn't a place where logic holds," she whispered. "It's a place where intention matters. Keep your mind calm, focused. Fear is as dangerous as any creature here." Mason's mouth was dry as he nodded, taking a steadying breath, but the prickling at the back of his neck only grew. His instincts screamed that they weren't alone. The forest seemed to press closer, as though eager to swallow them whole, and he struggled to suppress the urge to break into a run, knowing that giving in to fear would be the worst thing they could do. Then he heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, threading through the air like smoke. It was a low, unintelligible murmur, almost too soft to hear, but it clawed at his nerves, igniting a primal terror deep within him. He stopped in his tracks, straining to hear, and as he listened, the murmur grew clearer, forming into fragmented words that he couldn't quite piece together. The others seemed to hear it too, their eyes widening as they glanced around, each of them standing rigidly still. The whispering grew louder, the words slipping in and out of coherence, a voice both ancient and angry. It sounded like a warning, a summons, something that had been waiting a long time to be heard. "Do you hear that?" Mason breathed, his voice barely audible. Naira nodded, her expression tight with dread. "We need to keep moving. Don't listen too closely. It's trying to pull you in." Dr. Ellis took a hesitant step back, his face a mix of terror and fascination. This is incredible. It's as if the forest itself is alive, as if it's communicating." Before he could finish, Ian grabbed his arm, yanking him forward. "Less talking, more moving," he muttered, his tone deadly serious. "Whatever it's saying, it's not friendly." Reluctantly, Dr. Ellis fell back in line, casting anxious glances over his shoulder as they resumed their silent march. The whispering faded as they moved, but the sense of being followed only grew stronger, like something was pressing in from all sides, waiting for one of them to falter. They climbed a rocky incline, the footing treacherous as loose stones and damp leaves slipped underfoot. At the top, Mason paused to catch his breath, and as he looked back, he saw it, a massive shadow standing at the bottom of the incline, half hidden by the mist, its shape more suggestion than form. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Mason knew with an instinctual certainty that it was watching them, waiting. Heart pounding, he quickly looked away, his mind racing. Naira's warning echoed in his head, "Do not acknowledge it." He gritted his teeth, forcing his gaze forward, but he could feel its presence like a cold hand pressing down on his shoulder, urging him to turn back. They continued down the other side of the incline, and the forest seemed to open up slightly, the trees thinning just enough for a faint light to pierce the canopy. Mason's heart leapt at the sight. It wasn't freedom, but it felt like a reprieve, however small. As they moved into this lighter patch, the oppressive heaviness around them lifted, and Mason felt his shoulders relax, tension he hadn't even realized he'd been holding, releasing in a wave of shaky relief. He glanced at the others, seeing the same fleeting hope mirrored in their faces. But then, from the shadows behind them came another sound, a low, echoing howl that cut through the silence like a knife. It was long, mournful, and filled with a rage that made the blood drain from Mason's face. The howl didn't belong to any creature he knew, and as it faded, he felt a grim certainty settle over him. They hadn't escaped. Whatever was out there wasn't done with them yet. The howl seemed to cling to the air, its eerie echo spiraling through the trees, saturating the forest with an anger that felt almost tangible. Mason's skin prickled as the sound faded, but its presence remained, lingering like a dark fog that seeped into his mind. He glanced at the others, each of them frozen, their faces pale, bodies tense, as if any movement might bring the creature's fury crashing down upon them. Naira's voice broke the silence, low and controlled, though a slight tremor hinted at the fear beneath her composure. "Keep moving. Don't think about it. Don't let it settle in your mind." Mason swallowed, nodding, but the weight of the howl still pressed on his chest, a reminder of the force that stalked them. They resumed their march, picking up their pace, though each step felt laden with dread, every rustle in the trees triggering the urge to look back. He forced himself to focus on the ground ahead, matching his steps to Naira's steady rhythm, trying to block out the creeping fear gnawing at him. Dr. Ellis was muttering under his breath again, his voice a nervous tremble. This doesn't make sense. There's no creature known to science that sounds like that would follow. It's as if it's aware of us, studying us." "Shut it, Ellis," Ian hissed, his eyes hard and focused. "Whatever it is, it's not one of your theories. Talking about it isn't going to help us." Ellis fell silent, his face drawn and haunted, and Mason could see the desperate struggle in his eyes. The scientist was fighting to reconcile everything they'd experienced with his world of logic and reason, and Mason couldn't help but wonder if such a reconciliation was even possible here. This place defied explanation, operating under rules none of them could understand, and any attempt to grasp it seemed as futile as trying to hold water in his hands. The path narrowed, leading them through a twisted grove of trees whose branches arched over the trail like bony fingers. The air grew colder, and the mist thickened, swirling around their feet, as if trying to latch on, to drag them into the shadows. Mason's heart hammered in his chest, his breath shallow as they pushed forward, each step feeling more reluctant than the last. Then, without warning, Naira stopped, her body rigid, her head tilted slightly as though listening. Mason held his breath, the silence around them becoming almost unbearable. The forest was completely still, yet the air was thick with something he could only describe as a presence, a heaviness that pressed down on him, filling his lungs with each strained breath. "What is it?" he whispered, barely daring to break the silence. She glanced back, her face pale but determined. "It's here. Close. I can feel it." A chill swept over him, and he felt a pulse of fear ripple through the group. Ian clutched his knife, his knuckles turning white, while Dr. Ellis stood perfectly still, eyes wide and unblinking, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. None of them moved, as if the slightest sound would summon whatever lurked just beyond their sight. Slowly, deliberately, Naira pointed to a thick patch of shadow under a nearby tree. Mason squinted, trying to discern what she saw, and his breath caught in his throat. There, partially obscured by darkness and mist, was a figure, a hulking, amorphous shape that seemed to merge with the shadows, its outline barely distinguishable. It was massive, its form impossible to fully comprehend, as if it was both solid and ethereal, existing at the edge of reality. The creature shifted, a low growl reverberating from deep within its chest, and Mason's body locked in place, fear rooting him to the spot. The sound was unlike anything he'd ever heard, a blend of fury and warning, primal and ancient, reaching into some primal part of his mind and freezing him in place. Naira's voice came in a strained whisper. "We're going to move, slowly. No sudden movements. Don't look directly at it, just walk." With painstaking caution, they began to inch backward, each step deliberate and silent, their eyes averted from the creature, though Mason could feel its gaze on them, heavy and penetrating, as if it were searching the depths of their souls. His body trembled with the urge to run, but he held himself steady, following Naira's lead. They moved slowly, edging toward a small thicket just off the trail, the forest closing in around them as if offering protection. Mason dared a final, sidelong glance at the creature and saw something that filled him with a cold, gnawing dread, the creature's eyes gleaming faintly in the darkness. They weren't animal eyes. They held a glimmer of intelligence, of awareness, a knowing that defied explanation. He quickly looked away, his heart hammering as they slipped into the cover of the thicket. Once concealed, Naira signaled for them to crouch, and they sank into the dense brush, their breaths shallow and silent. For several agonizing moments, they waited, barely daring to breathe, every muscle tense. The creature's form shifted, moving with a fluidity that defied its massive size, as it seemed to inspect the spot where they had just stood. It sniffed the air, a deep, resonant inhale that filled the silence, and Mason clenched his jaw, hoping, praying that it wouldn't find them. After what felt like an eternity, the creature turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving only the mist and the cold in its wake. The group remained crouched in the thicket, barely daring to breathe, each of them straining their ears to catch the faintest sound of the creature. It had disappeared into the shadows, but its presence still lingered, pressing down on them like a dark weight. Mason's pulse was a dull, relentless drumbeat in his ears, his muscles cramping from the effort of holding still, yet he didn't dare shift. Not yet. Naira was the first to move, her hand gesturing for silence as she scanned the woods, her eyes sharp and focused. She remained utterly still, listening, her head tilted slightly as though tuning into a sound just out of reach. After a long moment, she gave a slight nod, signaling that it was safe to rise, though her movements remained cautious, every gesture controlled. One by one, they emerged from the thicket, each person careful not to make a sound. Dr. Ellis looked as though he might collapse, his face pale and glistening with sweat. Ian's grip on his knife hadn't loosened, his hand shaking slightly as he scanned the shadows with wary eyes. Mason could feel his own fear still clawing at him, a persistent, primal urge to flee, but he pushed it down, focusing instead on matching Naira's deliberate calm. "We're on borrowed time," Naira whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "It's hunting us now, testing our movements. If we're going to make it out, we need to stay together and keep moving." Ian's jaw tightened. "And if it catches up to us? If it decides to attack?" Naira met his gaze, her eyes hardened. "Then we don't give it a reason. We stay quiet, avoid direct eye contact, and keep our heads down. This forest, it doesn't respond to us like other places. It reacts to intent, to energy. If we act like prey, it'll treat us like prey. The implication was clear. Whatever this creature was, it wasn't bound by the rules of the natural world. It was something older, something that fed off their fear and intentions, as if every emotion they felt fueled its awareness. Dr. Ellis, still visibly shaken, managed to nod, his voice a faint tremble. Then, what are we supposed to do? Just pretend it's not there while it's following us? Yes, Naira replied, her voice calm but firm. That's exactly what we do. We focus on each step. Stay mindful, stay silent. We're in its territory, and we have to respect that if we want any chance of getting out. Mason felt a surge of gratitude for her presence, her steady control the only anchor he had in this increasingly surreal nightmare. He could tell the others felt it too, even Ian, whose usual cynicism had given way to a reluctant acceptance of her guidance. They started moving again, each step slow and deliberate, the forest now a living, breathing entity around them. The mist thickened as they descended a narrow trail winding through dense undergrowth, shadows creeping closer with every step. Mason focused on his breathing, in and out, trying to keep his mind clear, but his nerves were frayed, stretched thin as he fought the persistent urge to look over his shoulder. Every so often he caught the faintest hint of movement in his peripheral vision, a flash of darkness shifting in the shadows, a suggestion of something lurking just beyond sight. He forced himself not to react, keeping his gaze steady, his pace even, though his pulse hammered with each step. They wove through the forest in a tense silence, the thick branches clawing at their clothes, the underbrush crunching softly beneath their boots. Occasionally, the creature's low, guttural breathing echoed through the trees, reminding them that it was still there, still watching, waiting for them to slip. Then, they came upon a small clearing, the trees parting to reveal a patch of ground covered in patches of moss and ferns, with a large, flat rock in the center. Naira signaled for them to stop, her gaze fixed on something in the clearing. Mason followed her eyes, and his stomach turned. Scattered across the ground were bones, small, delicate, and arranged in a pattern that looked disturbingly deliberate. The bones formed a spiral leading up to the large rock at the center, where a single larger skull rested, hollow eye sockets staring blankly at the sky. Dr. Ellis took a shaky step forward, his eyes wide with horror. This is a ritual, a warning. Ian grimaced, his face pale. Us? Or to it? Naira's voice was barely a whisper, perhaps to both. Mason's gaze shifted to the edges of the clearing, his body prickling with a sense of foreboding that felt almost suffocating. The bones seemed to resonate with the same energy as the forest, as though they'd been placed with intent, marking something sacred, something that demanded reverence or fear. "We shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a murmur. Naira nodded, her expression grim. "We need to move. Quickly." As they skirted the clearing, Mason could feel the weight of the skull's empty stare on his back, its hollow eyes watching them leave. The forest felt closer now, its dark heart pulsing with a silent, ancient power that resonated in his bones. And as they continued, he felt it. The relentless shadow slipping through the trees behind them, still following, still waiting, as if it knew that they hadn't yet seen the worst that this forest had to offer. The path beyond the clearing wound tighter, forcing them to brush against thick, damp foliage that seemed to pull at their clothes, slowing their progress. Each step felt like a struggle now, as though the forest itself resisted their movement, reluctant to let them go. Mason's heart pounded, his mind replaying the image of that skull in the clearing, the empty socket staring at him as if issuing a silent warning. Naira led them onward, her movements purposeful but tense, her head slightly tilted, always listening. Mason stayed close behind her, every sense heightened, each snap of a twig or rustle of leaves making him flinch. He was painfully aware of the presence stalking them, the creature hidden in the shadows, watching and waiting. It hadn't shown itself again, but its presence was like a storm cloud on the horizon, imminent and inevitable. The forest around them grew denser, the trees twisting and stretching in unnatural ways, branches intertwined like skeletal fingers. The mist clung closer, damp and cold, wrapping around their legs, making the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. The oppressive silence was broken only by their own ragged breaths and the occasional murmur of unease from Dr. Ellis, who kept glancing back as though expecting the creature to leap out of the darkness at any moment. Ian's voice, low and barely a whisper, broke the silence. "How much farther, Naira? We've been going in circles. Are you sure we're headed the right way?" Naira didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the narrow path ahead, brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. "There isn't a right way in a place like this. The forest shifts, especially when it knows we're intruding, but I'm following signs. The land speaks, even here." Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He glanced at Ian, whose jaw was clenched in frustration, but he kept his silence, perhaps sensing that pushing Naira wouldn't help. They trudged on, each step a heavier burden, the weight of their fear settling like lead in their chests. Then, as they rounded a bend in the trail, Naira suddenly stopped, raising her hand in a signal to freeze. Mason stopped short, his heart racing, his gaze darting to where Naira was staring. Ahead of them, partially hidden in the mist, was another structure, a crude makeshift hut built from tree limbs and vines, its roof sagging under the weight of rotting moss. The hut seemed ancient, a relic of some long-forgotten ritual, and as they approached, Mason could see strange symbols carved into the wooden beams, dark shapes that twisted in patterns he couldn't comprehend. Dr. Ellis took a step closer, his eyes alight with a mix of fascination and horror. This is incredible. It's like some kind of primitive shelter, but look at these carvings. They're ancient, almost like a language. Naira's expression was grim as she examined the hut, her fingers brushing against one of the symbols. "These are wards," she said quietly. "They're meant to protect or to keep something contained. Whoever built this, they understood what they were dealing with. They feared it." Ian took a step back, eyeing the hut warily. "We should stay away from this. It's bad enough we're already deep in this cursed place." Mason felt an odd compulsion tugging at him, urging him to look inside, to see what lay within the rotting walls. Against his better judgment, he stepped forward, peering into the dark interior. His flashlight beam cut through the shadows, illuminating a small, empty space, except for a strange bundle in the center, wrapped in decaying cloth and bound with knotted vines. A cold sweat prickled on his skin as he took in the sight. The bundle was covered in strange, dark stains, and he felt an instinctual revulsion, a warning flaring up within him to look away, to leave it untouched. "Naira," he called softly, his voice barely more than a breath. "There's something here." She joined him, her eyes narrowing as she took in the bundle, her face etched with a deepening dread. "It's an offering," she murmured, her voice laced with reverence. "Or a warning, perhaps both. They left it here for the creature, or for the spirits, to appease them." Dr. Ellis looked like he wanted to inspect it more closely, but Naira's sharp gaze held him back. "We're not here to disturb anything. Show your respect and back away." Now, reluctant Mason took a step back, feeling the weight of the hut's ancient history pressing down on him. As he moved away, he noticed something scratched into the dirt just outside the doorway, a crude symbol resembling an eye surrounded by concentric circles. Naira's gaze fell upon it, her face pale. "It's a guardian mark," she whispered. "A final line of defense. Whatever this place once held, it's no longer here, but something still remembers." A chill ran down Mason's spine as he followed her away from the hut, feeling as though they'd crossed another invisible boundary, one they couldn't return from. And as they moved on, the forest felt heavier, darker, as if the ancient structure had left its mark on them. And now, whatever dwelled here knew them, remembered them, claimed them as its own. As they left the ancient hut behind, Mason felt the atmosphere around them shift, like a cold breath exhaled by the forest itself. It felt as though the land had stirred, acknowledging their presence in some dark, unseen way. Each step they took felt like it resonated deeper into the ground, as if the forest was drawing them further into its web. They walked in tense silence, each of them acutely aware of the oppressive energy that clung to the air. Thicker now, more deliberate. Mason caught himself glancing back at the path behind them, half expecting to see the shadowed figure standing there, watching, but the forest remained still, an eerie quiet settling over it like a shroud. Dr. Ellis broke the silence, his voice subdued and shaky. I can't stop thinking about that bundle," he whispered, his tone laced with equal parts fear and fascination. "Whatever was in there, it was significant, ritualistic." Ian grunted, eyes narrowed as he scanned the surrounding trees. Significant, yes, but not something we should be thinking about. This whole place feels like a trap. Mason couldn't disagree. The urge to leave, to escape the weight of the forest, grew stronger with each step, but something kept them moving forward, a sense that turning back now was not only impossible, but would anger whatever dark force had been following them. They came to a narrow trail that descended into a small valley, the land sloping steeply downward. The trees here were twisted, their branches interlocking above like a skeletal canopy, blotting out what little light remained. The mist was thicker, curling around their legs like hungry fingers, clinging to their clothes, weighing them down. Each step felt like wading through something alive, something that didn't want them to leave. Naira stopped at the edge of the valley, her eyes scanning the twisted trees ahead. Her face was set in a hard line, her usual calm replaced by a strained resolve. "We're entering one of the deepest parts of the Veiled Lands," she said quietly, almost to herself. "The place where the elders said the shadows are oldest, where memories become real." Mason felt a chill grip him, and he looked at her with a mix of confusion and dread. Memories become real? What does that mean? Naira's gaze didn't waver. Here, thoughts and fears, they can take form. This place doesn't just know us, it reflects us. Whatever you're afraid of, whatever you doubt, it finds a way to bring it to life. Dr. Ellis's eyes widened, panic flashing across his face. "Are you saying this place, it feeds off us? Like some kind of sentient mirror?" Naira nodded slowly, her eyes shadowed with a gravity that made Mason's skin crawl. "Yes, but it's not simply feeding, it's transforming. Our fear fuels it, and in return, it manifests those fears in ways we can't understand. This is why it's so dangerous. The forest is a living memory, and now we're part of it." They moved forward, descending into the valley with a newfound wariness. Mason could feel the oppressive weight of the forest intensify, pressing down on them as if testing their resilience. Every step echoed, the crunch of leaves underfoot strangely muted, as if the ground were absorbing their presence. As they reached the valley floor, the fog thickened, so dense that Mason could barely see more than a few feet ahead. Shadows twisted within the mist, shapes that seemed to dart just out of reach, teasing them, taunting them. Every now and then he thought he could hear faint whispers, ghostly voices weaving through the trees, murmuring words he couldn't understand. Then he saw it. Just beyond the fog, a familiar shape, a silhouette he hadn't expected to see. His heart lurched as he recognized the figure, tall and unmistakable. It was his father, standing there in the mist, his face just barely visible, his eyes hollow and unreadable. Mason blinked, his rational mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with reality. His father had died years ago. No, this isn't real," he whispered, gripping the strap of his camera tightly, his knuckles white. But the figure remained, unmoving, watching him with that same hollow stare he'd remembered from his father's last days. Naira's warning echoed in his mind. The forest reflects us, our fears. He forced himself to look away, heart pounding as he willed himself to focus on the path, on the others. But the sight of his father's face lingered, a ghostly after-image in his mind. A strangled gasp escaped Dr. Ellis as he stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror. Mason glanced over to see what had startled him, and his breath caught in his throat. A woman stood in front of Dr. Ellis, her face obscured by dark hair, her figure draped in ragged, dirt-stained clothing. She reached out toward him, her fingers twisted and unnaturally long. "Amelia," Dr. Ellis whispered, his voice trembling. It can't be. You're gone." Ian cursed under his breath, grabbing Ellis by the arm. "It's not real, Ellis. Whatever you're seeing, it's a trick. Keep your mind focused." But Mason could see the way Ellis shook, the haunted look in his eyes. It wasn't just a vision, it was his worst fear, dredged up from the depths of his mind and given form by the forest. As they stumbled through the valley, Mason felt his own fear gnawing at him. The image of his father's hollow eyes burned into his mind. The forest was in their heads now, feeding on every secret terror they held close, and he knew, with a growing horror, that it wouldn't stop until it had torn each of them apart. The valley floor seemed to stretch endlessly before them, an expanse of thick mist and twisted shadows that moved with an eerie, fluid rhythm. The silence was punctuated by shallow, panicked breaths, and the occasional stifled gasp as each of them wrestled with the visions pulling at their minds. Mason kept his gaze forward, forcing himself to ignore the shapes that flickered just at the edge of his vision, feeling his father's hollow gaze still pressing on him like a weight. Naira led them onward, her movements more urgent now, as though she too could sense the forest closing in on them, feeding off their deepest fears. Dr. Ellis stumbled beside Mason, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead as he clutched his arms to his chest, as if to keep his own terror at bay. His eyes kept darting around, watching the mist for glimpses of the woman he'd called Amelia, the one he couldn't seem to shake. "You need to block it out, Ellis," Mason whispered, barely moving his lips, hoping his voice would somehow ground the trembling man. "It's not real. It's this place, trying to make us lose ourselves." Ellis nodded weakly, his breathing uneven. "I know," he murmured, "but it feels so real. I can hear her voice, calling to me. She's here, Mason. I know she's here." Before Mason could respond, Ian cursed softly, his voice cutting through the haze. "This is madness," he hissed. "We're walking right into the heart of whatever this is. We should turn around, leave this valley and find another way out." Naira shot him a hard look, her expression resolute. "There is no other way. If we turn back, we only give it more power. The only way out is through." Her gaze softened, a rare flicker of empathy crossing her face. "Trust me. I've seen what happens when people try to run from it." Ian clenched his jaw, clearly unwilling but ultimately silent, his face etched with frustration and fear. Mason felt a pang of sympathy for him. Ian was used to being the strong one, the one who took control in difficult situations, but here in the heart of the Veiled Lands, his strength meant little. None of their usual defenses mattered in a place that twisted reality with every step. They pressed on, moving faster now, the oppressive mist thickening until they could barely see one another. Every step echoed in Mason's mind, every breath drawn with effort, as though the air was laden with something heavy and toxic, a poison crafted from their own anxieties. The whispers in the mist grew louder, almost rhythmic, blending together into a chorus of unintelligible murmurs that seemed to throb in the air. And then, abruptly, they entered a small clearing, a round space in the mist where the ground was bare, the dirt dark and damp, as if recently disturbed. At the center of the clearing was a ring of stones, carefully arranged, with small bundles nestled between them, wrapped in decayed cloth and bound with strands of hair. The bundles looked disturbingly familiar, like the one they had seen in the hut, each one exuding a sense of something long buried, something they had no right to disturb. Naira held up a hand, stopping them at the edge of the circle. "This is a boundary," she whispered. "A place of containment. This forest has layers, boundaries that keep things contained. Crossing into this circle means passing into the forest's oldest part, the part where even the spirits fear to roam." Ian's face tightened with barely concealed dread. "Then why the hell are we still here? If this is a place that even the spirits avoid, then we're..." Before he could finish, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the mist, reverberating from somewhere just beyond the clearing. It was the same sound they'd heard before, the low, menacing growl of something massive and ancient, its rage simmering like a fire banked by centuries of waiting. They froze, each of them tense, eyes darting around the edges of the clearing as the growl grew louder, closer. Mason's hands trembled as he gripped his camera, a ridiculous instinct to document whatever happened next, clashing with his overwhelming urge to run. But there was nowhere to go. The forest was alive around them, its every shadow watching, waiting. Dr. Ellis took a shaky step back, his face pale, whispering, "It's coming. Whatever it is, it's coming." Naira turned to face the others, her expression hardening. "Stand still. Do not run. If you run, it will chase you, and it won't stop." Mason's heart hammered as he struggled to hold himself still, every muscle poised to flee, yet held in place by sheer will. He focused on his breathing, fighting to drown out the pulse of terror that urged him to bolt. The mist began to shift, swirling as though something massive moved within it, the shadows bending, stretching, taking on shapes that defied reason. And then, just beyond the edge of the circle, a figure began to emerge. It was enormous, its form barely discernible through the mist, yet unmistakably alive, a creature forged from shadow and fury. It towered over them, its limbs twisted, eyes gleaming with a predatory intelligence. locked onto each of them as though it could see straight into their souls. It didn't move, didn't lunge or growl again, but the force of its presence was enough to root them to the ground. Mason felt his breath catch, a terror so profound that he felt as though his heart had stopped. He didn't dare blink, didn't dare breathe, and in that still, terrible silence, the creature's gaze passed over them, studying them, evaluating them. It seemed to linger on Mason, as if sensing something within him, something it recognized. The weight of that gaze was unbearable, ancient and relentless, and he felt his mind teeter on the edge, ready to splinter under the force of its attention. Then, with a slow, almost deliberate motion, the creature began to back away, melting into the mist, leaving them in the heavy silence of the clearing, each of them trembling, each of them forever changed. The silence after the creature's retreat was almost deafening, filling the air with an emptiness that felt unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. Mason's legs felt weak, his entire body trembling from the encounter, but he forced himself to stay standing, gripping his camera strap with white-knuckled hands as it were a lifeline. The others looked equally shaken. Dr. Ellis had sunk to his knees, his eyes glazed, his mouth slightly open as he stared into the mist where the creature had disappeared. Ian was breathing heavily, a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, his usual defiance now dulled by the raw fear he had just experienced. Only Naira remained outwardly composed, though even she seemed rattled, her face pale, her eyes shadowed with something deeper than fear, an understanding, perhaps, that this was only the beginning. We can't stay here," Ian finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "That thing, it let us go, but it won't stay away, not if we linger." Naira nodded, her expression grim. "You're right, this is sacred ground, an old boundary. The forest is warning us, but we're not free yet. We need to move, and we need to do it carefully. It knows us now, it's part of us." Dr. Ellis rose shakily to his feet, wiping his forehead with a trembling hand. "Naira, what exactly is it? You must have some idea." His voice was thick with desperation, as though naming it might somehow lessen its power over them. Naira hesitated, her gaze drifting to the stones arranged in the circle, the strange bundles within it. "We call it the Silent Watcher. It's a guardian, a keeper of the veiled lands, born from the oldest shadows here. The elders say it was once human, but that it gave itself to the forest, binding itself to the land to protect something deeper within these woods, a curse, or perhaps a duty." Mason's stomach twisted at her words. He had thought the creature was simply a force of nature, an animal he couldn't understand. But this was something far darker, something intelligent, something with purpose. They left the clearing, moving as quietly as possible, each of them glancing over their shoulders, the presence of the Silent Watcher lingering heavily on their minds. The mist was thicker now, curling around their ankles and rising as they descended a narrow trail, twisting down into a ravine choked with dense underbrush. Mason had the unsettling feeling that the forest was guiding them, funneling them towards something inevitable. The path soon opened into another hollow, shrouded in an even deeper darkness. Here, the trees were ancient and gnarled, their branches woven together in thick tangles that blocked out what little light the mist allowed. The air was damp, filled with the rich, earthy scent of decayed leaves and something else, something faintly metallic, sharp, and unsettling. Naira stopped abruptly, holding up her hand, her gaze fixed ahead. "There's a passage here," she murmured, her voice barely more than a breath. "A place where the boundaries are weakest. If we cross it, we might find a way out of the veiled lands. But it's not without risk." "What kind of risk?" Ian asked, his voice low and wary. She glanced back at them, her face grave. "This passage, it's said to connect the living with the spirit world. If we go through it, we may not all come back as we are now. The forest has a way of changing people who dare to enter places they're not meant to." Dr. Ellis looked at her, his expression torn between fascination and dread. "Are you saying we could become like it? Like the Silent Watcher?" Naira's silence was answer enough. Mason swallowed hard, his mind racing as he weighed the risks. They were already deep within the forest, the boundaries closing in around them. But the idea of leaving this place, transformed into something twisted and bound to the land, chilled him to his core. And yet, what other choice did they have? The forest wasn't letting them go, not without a price. Whatever happens, Naira continued, we must move quickly and stay together. The forest thrives on separation, on division. If we lose sight of one another, it will find us. And it won't give us another chance. Her warning weighed heavily on them as they began to move toward the passage, an almost imperceptible gap between the trees where the mist thickened, swirling with a strange silvery hue. The air grew colder, biting into their skin, and Mason felt a surge of dread rise in him, as though crossing this threshold meant surrendering a part of himself that he could never reclaim. One by one, they stepped into the gap, and as Mason crossed, he felt a shiver roll down his spine, a sensation like cold fingers grazing his skin. It was as if the forest was peeling away layers of his consciousness, exposing him to something raw and ancient. As they emerged on the other side, Mason felt a subtle change, an almost imperceptible shift in the air. It was quieter here, the mist darker, and he could feel an intense stillness in the trees, as if they too were holding their breath, watching. The silence was heavy, not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something hidden, waiting. And then he felt it, a flicker of something just outside his field of vision. The silent watcher was with them still, just beyond the mist, moving with them, keeping its distance, yet tethered to them in an inexplicable way. The passage they had entered felt like a portal to another world, one where time and space warped, bending under the weight of ancient memories and unfathomable presences. The forest around them grew darker, the mist thicker and almost oily as it clung to their skin, pulling them deeper into its embrace. Mason could feel a pressure in his chest, a constant, pulsing awareness of the silent watcher somewhere behind them, shadowing their every step. The path wound tighter, narrowing to a barely perceptible trail bordered by towering trees whose trunks were twisted and scarred, marked with symbols and faces carved by hands that had long since vanished. Each step echoed in the oppressive quiet, their footsteps swallowed by the soft, damp ground, as if the forest itself was absorbing their presence. Naira moved with quiet determination, but even she seemed unnerved by this part of the forest. Her usual calm was strained, her eyes scanning the shadows as if expecting something to materialize from the mist. The air was thick with anticipation, as though the forest was bracing for a final confrontation, gathering strength from their fear. Dr. Ellis stumbled, catching himself on a nearby tree, his breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps. I don't know how much longer I can do this, he whispered, his voice trembling. It's inside my head, Naira. I can feel it. This place, it's in my mind, twisting things, making me see things. Naira's gaze softened, her voice gentle but firm. You're stronger than this, Ellis. We all are. The forest is testing us, but we have to keep our minds sharp. It wants us to break, to feed it with our fear. Ian looked at Ellis, his expression softened by a rare flicker of compassion. Just focus on getting out of here. Whatever you see, whatever you feel, it's not real. We're almost through this. Just keep your eyes on Naira. Ellis nodded weakly, pushing himself to his feet, but Mason could see the toll the forest had taken on him. They all looked exhausted, hollowed out by fear, yet driven forward by a sliver of hope that they might still find an escape. As they walked, Mason became aware of a new sound, soft and distant, like the faint hum of a chant. It was almost melodic, weaving through the trees, an eerie echo that filled him with an indescribable sadness. He strained his ears, trying to make out the words, but they remained just beyond his understanding, a language older than memory, flowing through the mist like a ghostly lament. Naira paused, tilting her head as she listened, her face taut with concentration. It's the voices of the veiled lands, she murmured, almost to herself. The forest's oldest spirits. They sing to keep the boundaries in place, to maintain the veil. Mason shivered, the song brushing against his mind, filling him with a yearning he couldn't quite explain, a feeling as if he were missing something fundamental, some lost part of himself that the forest had stolen. He shook his head, fighting off the sensation, grounding himself in the reality of their surroundings. The chanting grew louder as they entered another small clearing, where the mist parted to reveal a stone altar, worn and cracked, its surface covered in thick moss and vines. Around the altar lay fragments of bones, small and delicate, arranged in patterns similar to those they'd seen earlier. The chanting seemed to emanate from the altar itself, vibrating through the air, filling the clearing with its mournful song. Dr. Ellis took a step forward, his face transfixed by the sight. "This is incredible," he breathed, a glint of fascination overriding his fear. This is a relic, something ancient. It's as if the forest remembers." Naira stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Don't get too close. This place is charged with memories, with energy from those who came before us. It's sacred ground." Her voice held an edge of warning. "To the spirits here, we're intruders." Mason felt a cold shiver pass through him as he gazed at the altar. The stones seemed to pulse with a life of their own, whispering to him, calling to him, with a voice that resonated deep in his bones. It was as though the altar itself was aware, watching them with an intelligence that surpassed any human understanding. Ian turned away from the altar, his voice tight. "I don't care what it is. I just want to get out of here. We're tempting fate every second we stay." Naira nodded, her face solemn. "We move on, but we show respect. No sudden movements, no loud sounds. We leave quietly as if we were never here." As they began to edge out of the clearing, Mason felt the weight of countless unseen eyes on him, pressing down on his shoulders, a heavy, invisible force that seemed to judge him, to question his intentions. He kept his gaze lowered, each step measured, every instinct screaming at him to hurry, but knowing that haste would only provoke whatever lay hidden in the mist. Just as they reached the edge of the clearing, the chanting stopped abruptly, leaving a void in the air, a silence so deep it seemed to vibrate. Mason's heart pounded as he resisted the urge to turn around, his body tense with the sense that something was standing right behind them, watching. They slipped back onto the narrow trail, the mist closing in around them once more, and he felt the overwhelming weight of something left behind, some force in the forest that they had crossed paths with but would never fully comprehend. But the forest wasn't done with them. Not yet. The silent watcher was still there, keeping pace with them, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the moment when they would finally let their guard down. And as they moved further, Mason realized with a sinking certainty that whatever lay ahead would test them far beyond anything they had yet endured. The trail grew steeper, winding upward through a dense, tangled stretch of forest that felt more hostile than anything they had yet encountered. The mist had thickened again, swallowing up the faint light, so they moved in a half-gloom, guided only by instinct and the dim shapes of one another. Mason's breathing was shallow, his senses stretched to their limit, aware of every slight rustle, every faint shadow that shifted just beyond his sight. The silent watcher remained close, though invisible, in the shrouded depths of the forest. Mason could feel its presence lingering, a steady pressure that seemed to tighten around them, drawing closer as they moved. Every so often, he thought he heard the faintest crack of a branch or the heavy, deliberate step of something massive moving in tandem with their own hurried footsteps. He fought the urge to look back, fearing that acknowledging it would invite something irreversible. Ahead, Naira's posture was tense, her shoulders set and eyes scanning the ground. It was clear that even she felt the weight of the watcher's presence. They walked in silence, every sound feeling like an offense to the oppressive quiet around them. But the quiet was broken abruptly when Dr. Ellis stopped, turning toward the others with wide, frantic eyes. "I can't keep going," he whispered, his voice unsteady, barely a notch above hysteria. "This place, it's twisting things inside my mind. I can't tell what's real anymore. It's like I'm not even me." Ian turned to him, his face hard but understanding. "Keep it together, Ellis. None of us feel right here, but panicking won't help. We're too close to fall apart now." Ellis shook his head, his hands clenching and unclenching as though he were struggling to grasp something just out of reach. "No, you don't understand," he insisted, his voice growing louder. "It's like this forest knows me, knows things about me, things I've tried to bury. It's dredging them up, throwing them in my face." He glanced at Mason, his eyes hollow, filled with a haunted realization. "I see her, Mason. Every time I close my eyes, every shadow, I see her face. It's like she's here." Mason felt a pang of empathy for Ellis, but he knew that acknowledging the visions wouldn't help. The forest fed on weakness, on doubt and regret, and Ellis's memories, whatever haunted him, were only fuel for its dark, twisting power. Naira's voice was calm but firm. "The forest is relentless. It pulls from within, turning memories into anchors, binding you here. You must let it go, Ellis, or it will consume you. Ellis's face twisted with desperation, his fists clenched at his sides. He nodded, though it was clear the words did little to soothe him. They resumed walking, but Mason noticed that Ellis was falling behind, his steps hesitant, as if something unseen were pulling him back. Every so often, he'd glance over his shoulder, his expression one of tortured longing. And then it happened. A sudden, piercing scream shattered the quiet, echoing through the forest like a gunshot. Mason spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Ellis was no longer with them on the path. He had vanished into the mist, swallowed up by the shadows. Without thinking, Mason surged forward, his instincts overpowering his fear, his feet pounding over the uneven ground as he chased the source of the scream. "Ellis!" he shouted, his voice desperate, echoing into the mist, absorbed by the dense silence. The others followed, but their voices seemed muffled, as if the forest were deliberately dampening their calls, pulling Ellis further away, deeper into the shadows. They pushed through the underbrush, frantically searching for any sign of him. Ian cursed under his breath, his voice strained. "That fool, he was already half gone. This place has him now." "No," Naira said sharply, her tone fierce. "We don't leave anyone behind. Not here." They plunged deeper, driven by the sound of another cry, distant and weak, but unmistakably Ellis's voice. It was filled with fear, but also something else, a note of surrender, as though he were calling out to someone he had already accepted would claim him. Mason's heart ached as he followed the voice, feeling the forest pulling at him too, trying to draw him into the same dark allure that had ensnared Ellis. They emerged into a small clearing, empty except for the mist that lay heavy and thick, swirling with an unnatural energy. At the center stood a figure, hunched and ghostly, surrounded by the faint outlines of indistinct shapes that seemed to rise from the ground, merging with the mist. It was Ellis. His face pale and blank, eyes unfocused as he stared into the shadows. "Ellis!" Mason called, his voice strained. But Ellis didn't respond, his gaze fixed on something just beyond the reach of the mist, something that none of the others could see. "He's caught," Naira murmured, her face stricken. "The forest has taken hold of him." Mason moved closer, his every step feeling like an effort against an invisible pull, pop, a resistance that seemed to grow stronger the closer he got to Ellis. The air was thick, almost choking, filled with a faint whisper that Mason couldn't understand, but felt deep within his bones. He tried again, his voice hoarse. "Ellis, don't let it take you. We're right here." But Ellis only smiled faintly, his expression softened, as though he were gazing at someone he hadn't seen in a long, long time. He raised his hand, reaching toward the mist, and in that instant, Mason understood. Whatever Ellis saw, it wasn't a nightmare. It was something or someone he had longed for. Something the forest had woven from his deepest memories and regrets, an illusion designed to claim him. Naira's hand fell on Mason's arm, pulling him back. Her eyes were filled with sorrow. "We can't save him if he's willing to stay." As the mist closed around Ellis, Mason felt the crushing weight of loss, the forest claiming another soul, and with it, he felt an even darker realization that the forest now understood him too, knew what he feared, what he longed for, and it would use that knowledge against him before he could escape. The clearing felt emptier without Ellis, the weight of his absence pressing down on them like a tangible force. The mist seemed to swirl with an almost sentient satisfaction, as though the forest itself were savoring its victory, having claimed another spirit to add to its depths. Mason could still see the faint outline of Ellis's form fading into the shadows, his figure melting into the mist like a dream lost upon waking. It was a haunting image that seared itself into his memory, and he knew that the forest had done it deliberately, leaving him with a final glimpse of his friend's surrender. Naira's face was stony as she turned away from the spot where Ellis had vanished. She didn't speak, but the tension in her shoulders and the way her hands shook ever so slightly told Mason everything he needed to know. Even she, the one who seemed unbreakable, was shaken. She was too proud to admit it aloud, but Mason could feel the strain wearing on her, as though the forest was chipping away at her resolve with every step they took. "We move," she said, her voice tight. "We honor him by surviving. We keep his memory by making it out of here. That's all we can do now." Ian nodded, his face grim, though his eyes flashed with anger and frustration. "We should have held on to him. fought harder. This damned place, it's playing with us, turning us into puppets for its own sick games. His voice was thick with bitterness, but there was a note of helplessness beneath it that Mason had never heard from him before. Naira didn't respond, her gaze fixed forward, but Mason saw the slightest dip of her head, a brief flicker of agreement. They all knew the forest had them at its mercy. They were only players in whatever twisted story it had decided to tell, and with every step, it seemed to dig deeper into their minds, pulling out memories, regrets, fears, anything it could use to twist them into submission. As they left the clearing, the forest seemed to grow darker, the mist thickening until it felt like they were wading through water, each step harder than the last. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional crunch of leaves beneath their boots and the distant whisper of something lurking just beyond sight. Mason could feel the forest shifting, as though it were closing in on them, tightening its grip. He forced himself to breathe steadily, focusing on the faint glow of Naira's silhouette ahead, using her presence as an anchor. They descended into a narrow, winding ravine, the ground wet and uneven, their footing treacherous. Mason's concentration wavered, Ellis's disappearance replaying in his mind, his friend's final, vacant gaze a haunting reminder of the forest's power. He felt a creeping fear that the forest would do the same to him, that it would find some way to draw out his own regrets, his own weakness, and use them to unravel him piece by piece. A faint sound interrupted his thoughts, a soft murmur, familiar, comforting, and achingly distant. Mason stopped, his breath catching in his throat. It was the voice of his mother, whispering his name as she used to when he was a child, a gentle lullaby she'd sung when he was afraid of the dark. The sound tugged at him, filling him with an overwhelming longing and a bittersweet ache. He closed his eyes for just a moment, letting the sound wash over him, wrapping around him like a warm blanket. "Mason?" Her voice was soft, warm, carrying a tenderness that seemed to reach straight into his heart. He opened his eyes, the mist parting to reveal her figure just ahead, standing by a tree, her face half hidden in shadow. She looked exactly as he remembered, her eyes soft and warm, her arms open, waiting. His heart pounded, a primal part of him screaming that this was impossible, that she was gone. Yet another part of him, a child's instinct, unbreakable even after all these years, yearned to go to her, to let himself believe. "Mason," she called again, her voice a gentle plea. "Come here, sweetheart. Don't be afraid." He took an involuntary step forward, every logical thought slipping away as he stared at her, the image so perfect, so painfully real. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling as he moved closer, his mind clouded by the overwhelming sense of comfort she radiated. Just one more step and he'd be able to touch her, to feel the warmth of her embrace. But a hand gripped his shoulder, pulling him back sharply. "Mason!" Naira's voice cut through the haze, snapping him back to reality. He blinked, the vision of his mother shattering like a delicate glass. In her place stood a twisted shadow, like its form dark and flickering, reaching out with hands that dissolved into the mist as he watched. He staggered back, horror filling him as he realized how close he'd come, how easily he had been drawn in. "It's not real," Naira whispered fiercely, her grip on his arm unyielding. "The forest is inside your head, using your memories against you. Don't let it take hold." Mason swallowed, fighting to steady his breathing, nodding as he tore his gaze from the shadow. The warmth he'd felt was gone, replaced by a biting chill, and he could feel the forest's disappointment pressing in, angry at being denied another soul. They pressed onward, each of them moving with renewed caution, aware now that the forest's illusions would only intensify the deeper they went. Mason felt raw, exposed, as though his own mind had betrayed him, and with every step, he couldn't shake the fear that it would happen again, that next time he might not have the strength to pull himself back. The Silent Watcher was there, always present, always waiting, as though it sensed their vulnerability, circling them in anticipation of their eventual surrender. And Mason knew that it was only a matter of time before the forest tried again, drawing from the deepest parts of their souls to see if it could break them once and for all. The forest felt like it was closing in, its shadows darker, its mist denser. Each of their steps weighted with exhaustion and fear. Mason could feel the forest's frustration, its hunger. It had almost claimed him, nearly pulled him under with the vision of his mother, and he knew now that it wouldn't relent. It was as if the land itself were alive, an ancient force that demanded offerings and sacrifices, and it was determined to claim its due. They moved in silence, a fragile determination binding them together. Naira's steady presence led them, her steps purposeful despite the obvious toll the journey had taken on her. She kept her head high, her gaze forward, as if sheer will alone could carry them through. But even she couldn't hide the shadows in her eyes, the quiet strain etched into her face. Ian's breathing was heavy, his face drawn tight with fatigue. Mason noticed his hand resting on the handle of his knife, a futile comfort in a place where their weapons meant nothing. They all knew it, but Ian clung to it as if it were his last tie to a reality beyond this haunted wilderness. His gaze was wild, darting around at every sound, every flicker of movement in the mist. The ground began to slope upward, the incline sharp and difficult, their progress slow as they climbed, each of them stumbling occasionally on the roots that jutted out from the earth like skeletal hands. The mist had thinned just slightly, allowing glimpses of the sky above, though it was dark, painted in shades of deep gray, as though even the heavens had turned their gaze away from this cursed place. Just as they neared the top of the slope, a rustling sound echoed from the trees to their left. Mason's heart leapt, his body tensing as he glanced toward the noise, half expecting to see the Silent Watcher's dark form looming through the mist. But there was nothing, just the dense, impenetrable forest as still and silent as before. Yet he knew something was out there, watching, stalking them with relentless patience. He could feel it in his bones, a chill that went deeper than the cold air. It was the same presence that had followed them from the beginning, the force that had claimed Ellis, and it was only waiting for its next opportunity. Naira stopped abruptly, her head cocked slightly as she listened. Her expression shifted, a flicker of something in her eyes, realization or perhaps dread. She turned to them, her voice low. "We're nearing the heart of the Veiled Lands," she said. "This is where the Watcher is strongest. We're close to the boundary, but the forest will fight us for every step from here." Mason swallowed, his throat dry. He didn't ask what she meant by fight. He didn't need to. The forest had already shown them its power, its ability to reach into their minds and tear out memories, regrets, visions too tempting to resist. If this was only the beginning of its efforts, he wasn't sure he could endure what lay ahead. Ian shook his head, a grim determination etched into his face. "So it's now or never then. If this thing wants a fight, it's going to get one." But his bravado rang hollow in the silence, and Mason could see the uncertainty beneath his fierce expression. They all knew that this was a battle they couldn't win through strength alone. They moved forward, their steps slower, each one careful and calculated, as if sensing that the ground itself might betray them. The forest was unnervingly still, the kind of silence that felt alive, watching, waiting. Mason felt a growing pressure in his chest, an instinctual knowledge that something was wrong, that they were on the verge of an encounter that would define their fate. Then a low, resonant hum began to rise from the earth, vibrating up through their feet, filling the air with an unnatural energy. The sound grew louder, intensifying into a steady, pulsing rhythm that seemed to align with the beat of their hearts. Mason's vision swam as the vibrations grew stronger, his mind clouded, as if the very air were thick with some invisible force. Naira's voice cut through the haze, sharp and urgent. "Stay focused. It's trying to disorient us, to make us weak. Keep your mind clear." Mason gritted his teeth, fighting to push back the dizzying waves of sound and sensation that threatened to overwhelm him. But the hum was relentless, reaching into his mind, pulling at his thoughts, clouding his vision with images he couldn't quite make sense of. He saw flashes of his mother's face, Ellis's haunted expression, the Silent Watcher's dark, inscrutable gaze. They flickered in and out, each one bringing a surge of emotion, a threat to his focus. Through sheer force of will, he managed to regain control, grounding himself with the feel of the damp earth underfoot, the cold air in his lungs. He glanced at Naira, who was moving forward steadily, her face set in fierce concentration, guiding them with the strength of her resolve alone. The vibrations slowly faded, leaving them standing in an eerie silence, the forest watching, waiting for a misstep. They had endured this test, But Mason knew it was only a taste of what lay ahead, a final warning from a land that guarded its secrets viciously. At last, they reached a wide clearing, a stark and foreboding space that seemed to pulse with a presence all its own. There at the center was an arch of twisted branches, dark and foreboding, almost skeletal in its construction. It loomed tall, marking what felt unmistakably like a threshold. Nara turned to them, her face pale but determined. This is it. The heart of the Veiled Lands. Once we cross this, there's no turning back. Whatever happens, remember who you are. The forest will try to take that from you, but you must hold on. Mason looked at the archway, his heart pounding, a primal fear coursing through him. But he nodded, knowing that this was their only path to freedom. As they moved toward the arch, the Silent Watcher's presence swelled, pressing down on them with a dark, expectant energy, as though it sensed that this would be its final chance to break them. And Mason knew, in that moment, that the forest would stop at nothing to make them part of its story forever. The archway loomed before them, a dark and twisted frame of branches that seemed to reach up into the heavens, or perhaps down into the earth itself, as though it were a gateway between worlds. The air around it was thick, charged with an energy that buzzed in Mason's bones, an invisible barrier that seemed to hold back all the light and hope from the outside world. Beyond this point, he knew, lay the forest's heart, the place where the Silent Watcher and the forest itself drew their power. Naira took a deep breath, her gaze steady as she turned to face them. This is where it will test us. The forest will strip away everything you think you are, every memory, every fear. We must hold on to who we are, no matter what happens. It will use everything it knows about us, every regret, every doubt. But we're stronger than it wants us to believe. Mason nodded, his stomach churning with fear, yet her words struck a chord within him. He clung to that fragile hope, knowing it was all he had. Ian, his face tight and pale, looked resolute, though Mason could see the fear in his eyes, a fear they all shared. They stepped through the archway as one, and instantly the world shifted. The mist closed in around them, thick as smoke, swirling and shifting, forming shapes that flickered in and out of focus. Mason blinked, feeling an odd sense of weightlessness, as though he were floating, his feet barely touching the ground. The trees around them twisted and stretched, bending at unnatural angles, their branches curling like talons, reaching down toward him. The silence deepened, becoming a palpable thing, pressing down on them, filling the air with an almost deafening weight, and then, slowly, the shadows began to take shape. Mason saw his mother first, her figure emerging from the mist, her face soft and familiar, a tender smile on her lips. She reached out to him, her hand warm and real. He knew it wasn't her, knew it was only the forest manipulating his memories, but he could feel himself weakening, his heart aching with a longing he couldn't resist. Her voice drifted through the air, soft and gentle, calling his name, a plea for him to come closer. He took a step forward, drawn by the warmth of her presence, the comforting familiarity. But as he reached out to touch her, Naira's voice cut through the haze, sharp and unyielding. "Mason, don't let it take you. Remember who you are." He blinked, the illusion shattering as he pulled back, and his mother's form twisted, her face melting into something hollow, her eyes dark and empty. The figure dissolved into the mist, leaving him cold, shaken, but steady. Next to him, Ian was fighting his own battle, his face contorted in anguish as he stared at a shadowed figure before him, a young woman with gentle eyes and a sad smile. He whispered her name, someone from his past, a ghost that the forest had resurrected to ensnare him. Mason placed a hand on Ian's shoulder, grounding him, pulling him back from the edge. Ian shuddered, nodding in silent gratitude, his face pale but determined. The mist thickened, swirling around them, and Mason felt the forest's frustration, a dark energy rippling through the air as if it were infuriated by their resilience. But it didn't stop. The shadows grew darker, taking on new forms, monstrous shapes with eyes that gleamed in the half-light, mouths twisted in silent screams. The Silent Watcher appeared then, its massive, amorphous form emerging from the mist, its dark eyes fixed on them with an intensity that bordered on hatred. Mason felt its gaze pierce him, reaching into his mind, clawing at his memories, his regrets, every insecurity he'd ever buried. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stand tall, to remember Naira's words. Remember who you are. He focused on his mother's true memory, her real warmth, her laughter, the strength she had given him to face the world. He clung to that memory like a lifeline, letting it fill him, letting it anchor him to himself. Beside him, Ian and Naira did the same, grounding themselves in their own memories, their own truths. Mason could feel the forest recoiling, its energy wavering as if it couldn't penetrate the strength they were holding onto. The silent watcher let out a low, guttural sound, a mix of frustration and fury, its form twisting and convulsing, its shape losing cohesion. The mist around them began to thin, pulling back, retreating as the forest's hold weakened. Naira took a step forward, her voice calm but filled with unshakable strength. "This is your land, Watcher, but we are not yours to keep. We are only passing through, carrying the memories of those we have loved, and that is something you cannot take." The creature hesitated, its form flickering as if caught in an internal struggle. The shadows that surrounded them began to dissipate, the mist pulling away, revealing the faint outlines of trees, the sky above just beginning to lighten as though the night itself were surrendering. With a final haunting gaze, the silent watcher turned, melting back into the mist, its form dissolving into the forest, leaving them alone in the clearing. The air grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifting, and Mason felt the forest release them, its claim relinquished. They stood in silence, each of them shaken, exhausted, but alive. The archway behind them faded, the twisted branches collapsing in on themselves, sealing off the heart of the veiled lands. Together, they turned and walked toward the faint glow of dawn, breaking through the trees, each step carrying them closer to the world they knew, forever changed by the forest's test but stronger for having endured it.